On September 20th, 1946, one phone call detonated a political war inside Washington. Henry Wallace, former vice president and Roosevelt's chosen heir, was fired by President Harry Truman. No bombs, no battlefields. But what followed was a ruthless campaign that nearly tore the Democratic Party apart and reshaped the Cold War. The office was unnaturally quiet. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Commerce Department as Henry Wallace sat alone at his desk, eyes fixed on a black telephone. Washington was a city built on noise and motion, but at that moment, everything felt frozen. Wallace sensed what was coming. Power has a way of announcing its departure before it leaves. When the phone rang, the voice on the other end was calm and controlled. Harry Truman spoke politely, almost formally. There was no argument and no warning. The decision was final. Wallace was dismissed as Secretary of Commerce. The call lasted only minutes. The shockwave would last years. No cameras were present. No aides rushed in. But this was a decisive strike. In military terms, it was a command-level elimination carried out to restore discipline and unity. Truman was removing a liability from his own lines. Wallace understood instantly that this was not a disagreement. It was a purge. Only months earlier, Wallace had stood one heartbeat away from the presidency. He had sat across from Franklin Roosevelt while global war was planned and executed. He had represented American power on the world stage. Now he was being cast aside by a man Wallace believed was unqualified to command the post-war order. Wallace did not protest. He did not plead. Instead, he reached for the phone again and called his closest advisors. If Truman believed this firing ended the conflict, he was mistaken. This was not a retreat. It was the opening phase of a political counteroffensive that would shake Washington and threaten to fracture the Democratic Party at the very start of the Cold War. Before the firing, before the exile, Henry Wallace was not an outsider. He was embedded deep inside the American war machine. From 1941 to 1945, Wallace served as Vice President of the United States during the most destructive conflict in human history. This was not a ceremonial role. The war demanded constant motion, and Wallace was everywhere. While American forces fought across Europe and the Pacific, Wallace operated on a different front. He sat in cabinet rooms where production quotas meant victory or defeat. Tanks, bombers, steel fuel food. War was logistics, and Wallace understood that better than most. As chairman of the Board of Economic Warfare, he helped decide how America would mobilize its industrial power at a global scale. Wallace was also deployed abroad. He traveled through Latin America, China, and the Soviet Union as a personal representative of Franklin D. Roosevelt. These were not goodwill tours. They were strategic missions designed to hold fragile alliances together. Wherever Wallace went, he spoke with the authority of the White House. To foreign leaders, he was not a subordinate. He was the voice of Roosevelt himself. Unlike previous vice presidents, Wallace was visible. He gave speeches explaining America's war aims and its vision for the post-war world. He talked about cooperation, reconstruction, and a future without empires. To supporters, he was the moral conscience of the Roosevelt administration. To critics, he was dangerously idealistic. By the end of the war, Wallace had internalized his role. He did not see himself as a spare part. He saw himself as a central component of Roosevelt's system. When decisions were made, he was in the room. When history moved, he believed he was helping steer it. That belief would soon collide with political reality in a way Wallace never anticipated. By 1944, Henry Wallace no longer saw himself as just a vice president. In his mind, the line of succession was already written. For 4 years, he had stood beside Franklin D. Roosevelt through war crisis and global decision-making. Loyalty had been proven under fire. Wallace believed that loyalty mattered. That belief was not baseless. In 1940, Roosevelt had personally forced Wallace onto the Democratic ticket over the objections of party bosses. The message was unmistakable. Wallace was Roosevelt's choice. To Wallace, that moment defined everything that followed. If Roosevelt trusted him enough to defy his own party, then Wallace assumed the trust ran deeper than politics. As the war progressed and Roosevelt's health visibly declined, the implication became impossible to ignore. Whoever held the vice presidency would likely inherit the Oval Office. Wallace did not view this as ambition. He viewed it as responsibility. He believed he understood Roosevelt's vision better than anyone else alive, and that history was positioning him to carry it forward. Inside the administration, Wallace behaved like a man preparing for succession. He spoke confidently about the post-war order. He defended Roosevelt's policies with almost religious conviction. To allies, he sounded like continuity. To critics, he sounded presumptuous. But Wallace was certain of one thing: when the war ended, the future would need him. What Wallace failed to grasp was that succession in American politics is not earned through service alone. It is negotiated, bargained, and controlled by men who never appear on stage. While Wallace was looking at Roosevelt, the party leadership was looking at him and calculating the risk. And they did not like what they saw. While Henry Wallace was preparing himself for succession, the Democratic Party leadership was reaching a very different conclusion. To them, Wallace was not continuity. He was instability. His views on labor, civil rights, and foreign policy alarmed men whose priority was winning elections and maintaining control. These party bosses did not think in ideals. They thought in numbers, regions, and margins. Wallace was too liberal for the South, too sympathetic to unions for business donors, and too unpredictable in a world that was about to transition from war to fragile peace. Most importantly, they feared one scenario above all others. Franklin Roosevelt might not survive another term. By mid-1944, Roosevelt's health was visibly failing. The party understood the stakes with brutal clarity. The vice president was no longer a ceremonial role. It was a loaded weapon pointed at the future of the presidency. If Roosevelt died, Wallace would become President of the United States. To the party leadership, that outcome was unacceptable. In July 1944, senior Democratic leaders confronted Franklin D. Roosevelt directly. Their message was blunt. Wallace had to be removed from the ticket. Roosevelt resisted at first, but illness had weakened his leverage. He no longer had the energy to fight the machinery that had sustained him for decades. What Wallace never saw was that the battle was already over before it reached the convention floor. Decisions were being made in private rooms, not public halls. The same political machine that had once elevated him was now moving to neutralize him. Wallace still believed loyalty would protect him. The party had already decided he was a liability that could not be allowed anywhere near the Oval Office. The Democratic National Convention of 1944 opened in Chicago under the weight of war and uncertainty. Delegates packed the hall knowing one thing for certain. Whoever emerged as vice president might soon become president. Henry Wallace arrived, believing the fight was still his to win. Wallace was not without support. Thousands of delegates and grassroots activists believed in Roosevelt's liberal vision and saw Wallace as its natural continuation. On the convention floor, pro-Wallace chants surged with dangerous momentum. For a brief moment, it looked like the party bosses had lost control of the room. Then the machinery moved. Chicago Mayor Ed Kelly abruptly declared a fire hazard due to overcrowding and ordered the convention adjourned. The timing was surgical. The session ended just as Wallace's supporters were building toward a first ballot vote that could have locked in his nomination. Overnight, everything changed. While delegates slept, party leaders worked the phones, cut deals, and applied pressure. By morning, the momentum was gone. The path was cleared for a compromise candidate, a man viewed as safe, controllable, and politically harmless. His name was Harry Truman. When the second ballot was cast, Wallace was finished. The decision had not been made by voters or delegates, but by a system designed to protect itself. Wallace left Chicago believing he had been robbed. In reality, he had just learned a brutal lesson about American power. Idealism does not survive contact with party control. After Chicago, Henry Wallace waited for one thing: an explanation from Franklin Roosevelt. What arrived was a letter meant to soften the blow, but instead confirmed everything Wallace feared. Roosevelt told Wallace that if he were a delegate, he personally would have voted for him. On paper, it sounded like loyalty. In reality, it was meaningless. What Wallace did not know at first was that Roosevelt had written another note at the same time. In it, he told party leaders that he would be satisfied with either Harry Truman or Supreme Court Justice William Douglas as vice president. Roosevelt had played both sides. To Wallace, this was not political compromise. It was a betrayal of 4 years of service. For Wallace, the realization was devastating. He had believed Roosevelt would fight for him the way he had in 1940. Instead, when the moment came, Roosevelt chose peace with the party over loyalty to his vice president. Wallace had been expendable. The man he trusted most had stepped aside when it mattered most. That letter marked the true end of Wallace's future inside the Roosevelt system. The war had not defeated him. The voters had not rejected him. He had been removed quietly by men who decided that survival of the machine mattered more than continuity of vision. From that moment forward, Wallace's faith in the political order began to collapse, replaced by something far more dangerous: resentment mixed with conviction, waiting for a new target. After securing re-election in November 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a final move to contain the damage. He offered Henry Wallace the position of Secretary of Commerce. Officially, it was a key cabinet post. Unofficially, everyone understood what it was: a step down, a holding position, a way to keep Wallace visible but powerless. For a man who had been vice president during a global war, the offer was humiliating. Wallace knew it. Washington knew it. But Wallace accepted, not out of pride, but out of belief. He still trusted Roosevelt's vision. He still believed that loyalty and competence would eventually restore him to the center of power. Inside the administration, Wallace told himself this was temporary, that Roosevelt would recover his strength, that the party would recognize its mistake, that he would once again be called upon when decisions truly mattered. The title had changed, but Wallace believed the mission had not. What Wallace failed to account for was time. Roosevelt was dying. The war was ending. The political battlefield was shifting faster than Wallace could adapt. By accepting the Commerce Department, Wallace was not preserving his future. He was anchoring himself to a system that was already preparing to move on without him. On April 12, 1945, the system Wallace had built his life around vanished overnight. Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. There was no long transition and no adjustment period. The most powerful man in the world was gone, and the chain of command shifted instantly. Within hours, Harry Truman was sworn in as President of the United States. For the nation, it was a moment of uncertainty. For Henry Wallace, it was a personal nightmare. The man who had replaced him on the ticket was now sitting in the Oval Office. The irony was unbearable. Wallace had spent years shaping wartime policy at Roosevelt's side. Truman had spent only weeks as vice president and had met Roosevelt a handful of times. Yet Truman now commanded the American state, and Wallace served beneath him as a cabinet secretary. Wallace did not hide his contempt. To him, Truman was unprepared for the scale of the moment. A former haberdasher turned senator, elevated by party maneuvering rather than vision. Wallace believed the presidency had fallen into the hands of a man who did not understand the world Roosevelt had been building. Truman initially kept Wallace in the cabinet as Secretary of Commerce. It was a calculated move designed to reassure Roosevelt liberals and project continuity. But inside the cabinet room, the imbalance was clear. Wallace was no longer a successor in waiting. He was a subordinate watching history slip through his fingers, convinced that the wrong man was now giving the orders. Inside the cabinet room, the divide became impossible to hide. Henry Wallace and Harry Truman were now fighting over the future of the world itself. The war was over, but the next conflict was already forming. It would not begin with armies. It would begin with assumptions. At the center of the dispute stood one man, Joseph Stalin. Wallace believed Stalin could be reasoned with. He saw the Soviet Union as scarred by war and desperate for security. In Wallace's mind, cooperation would lead to trust, and trust would prevent another global catastrophe. Truman saw something entirely different. He watched Soviet forces tighten their grip on Eastern Europe. Agreements made at Yalta were ignored. Elections were postponed or rigged. German industry was stripped and shipped east. To Truman, this was not defensive behavior. It was expansion under cover of diplomacy. Wallace argued his case relentlessly. He sent memoranda. He requested private meetings. He warned that American firmness would provoke fear, and fear would lead to war. Truman listened, nodded, and moved on. Decisions were being made elsewhere, guided by intelligence reports and a growing consensus that Moscow respected strength, not goodwill. For Wallace, the realization was crushing. He was no longer shaping policy. He was observing it from the sidelines. The man he believed was unfit to lead was now steering American strategy toward confrontation. Wallace became convinced that silence was no longer an option. If he could not stop Truman inside the administration, he would have to do it somewhere else. By early 1946, Henry Wallace was running out of patience. Inside the administration, his influence had collapsed. His warnings about the Soviet Union were ignored. His memos disappeared into filing cabinets. Requests for direct access to the president were delayed or denied. Wallace was still in the cabinet, but he was no longer in the fight. At the same time, American foreign policy was hardening. Reports from Europe painted a grim picture of Soviet behavior. Intelligence assessments warned that Moscow interpreted compromise as weakness. One document in particular circulated through Washington with growing influence. It argued that the Soviet system respected only strength and containment. To Wallace, this thinking was reckless. To Harry Truman, it was reality. Wallace believed the administration was drifting toward a catastrophic miscalculation. He had seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He understood what another great power war would mean in the age of atomic weapons. In his mind, Truman's policies were not preventing conflict. They were accelerating it. Wallace became convinced that history would not forgive silence. The final shift came when Wallace realized he no longer saw himself as part of Truman's team. He did not believe the president represented Roosevelt's legacy. He believed the White House had been captured by advisors who saw the world only through force and confrontation. To Wallace, that worldview was not just wrong. It was dangerous. By September 1946, Wallace made a decision that would end his place in government forever. If he could not change policy behind closed doors, he would take the argument directly to the American people. It was a calculated risk, and Wallace understood the stakes. In military terms, he was preparing to break formation and advance alone into hostile territory. On September 12, 1946, Henry Wallace stepped onto the stage at Madison Square Garden before a crowd of nearly 20,000 people. The setting mattered. This was not a policy seminar or a closed party meeting. It was a public arena packed with Americans desperate to believe another war could be avoided. Wallace spoke with confidence and moral certainty. He warned that American firmness toward the Soviet Union was pushing the world toward disaster. He argued that atomic weapons had made Moscow fearful and defensive. He claimed Soviet control of Eastern Europe was about security, not conquest, and insisted cooperation would lead to free elections and lasting peace. At the same moment Wallace was speaking in New York, the Truman administration was sending a very different message overseas. James Burns was in Paris, negotiating with the Soviets from a position of strength. Wallace's words directly undercut that effort. To foreign governments, it looked like the United States was divided against itself. The crowd inside the garden loved the speech. They applauded the promise of peace and restraint. But in Washington, the reaction was explosive. Reporters immediately asked whether Wallace's remarks represented official policy. Diplomats warned that Moscow would interpret the speech as weakness and disunity. Within hours, cables began flying across the Atlantic. Burns demanded clarity from the White House. Either Wallace spoke for the administration or he did not. If he did, American foreign policy had changed overnight. If he did not, Wallace had crossed a line that no cabinet officer was allowed to cross. The battle Wallace had taken public was now impossible to contain. The morning after the Madison Square Garden speech, Washington went into damage control mode. Reporters flooded the White House with a single question: did Henry Wallace speak for the administration or not? The issue was no longer ideological. It was operational. Foreign policy requires unity, and that unity had just been shattered on a public stage. President Harry Truman tried to contain the fallout. When asked whether he had approved Wallace's speech, Truman answered that he had approved it. What he meant was that Wallace's staff had submitted a draft and Truman had signed off without close review. In politics, that distinction was fatal. The approval was now on record. Within days, Truman attempted to walk it back. The White House issued statements saying Wallace's remarks reflected personal views, not official policy. No one was satisfied. A cabinet member could not publicly contradict the president and then retreat behind personal opinion. The contradiction exposed weakness at the top and confusion throughout the government. Wallace refused to retreat. In interviews, he defended every word of the speech. He argued that the American people deserved an open debate about foreign policy. He accused Truman's advisors of pushing the nation toward war. Most dangerously, he implied that Franklin Roosevelt would have agreed with him, not with the current president. That implication crossed a line. Wallace was no longer arguing policy. He was challenging Truman's legitimacy as Roosevelt's successor. He was invoking the dead president's authority to undermine the living one. Inside the White House, the calculation became simple. As long as Wallace remained in the cabinet command, discipline was impossible. The confrontation was now inevitable. On September 20th, 1946, Henry Wallace was summoned to the White House. The meeting was short and tightly controlled. Harry Truman spoke plainly. A cabinet could not function with multiple voices on foreign policy. Wallace had two options: stop making public statements that contradicted administration policy, or step aside. Wallace did not hesitate. He argued that he had a constitutional right to speak freely. He insisted the American people deserved to hear alternative views on war and peace. He claimed Truman was abandoning Roosevelt's vision of cooperation and replacing it with confrontation. To Wallace, silence was complicity in disaster. Truman did not debate him. The decision had already been made. The president ended the meeting and returned to his office. There he dictated a letter accepting Wallace's resignation. Wallace had not offered one. Truman was removing him by force, not negotiation. The letter was delivered later that day. Wallace read it in his Commerce Department office, stunned. He had believed his political base gave him leverage. He thought Truman needed him to keep Roosevelt liberals inside the party. He had misjudged the battlefield completely. For Truman, the calculus was simple. Unity mattered more than appeasement. Policy coherence mattered more than factional peace. Wallace was not just dissenting. He was undermining American strategy at a critical moment. The firing was not personal. It was operational. And with that decision, Truman closed the door on compromise and opened a far more dangerous phase of the conflict. After his dismissal, Henry Wallace did not fade from view. He escalated. Traveling city to city, he delivered hundreds of speeches accusing the Truman administration of provoking the Soviet Union and pushing the world toward atomic catastrophe. Wallace framed containment as aggression and cooperation as the last path to peace. For a nation exhausted by war, the argument was powerful. Wallace's campaign fractured the Democratic base. Polls showed deep unease with Truman's foreign policy, and Wallace drew support almost entirely from liberal voters who once backed Roosevelt. Inside the White House, advisors feared Wallace did not need to win to be effective. He only needed to weaken Truman enough to hand victory to the Republicans. As Wallace's profile grew, so did the warnings. Soviet media quoted him extensively. Communist-aligned organizations helped organize events and amplify his message. Wallace rejected all concerns. He insisted that his words were being used because they were true, not because he was compromised. To intelligence officials, the danger was clear. Wallace had become an unprotected force in a global information war, convinced he was fighting for peace, while unknowingly serving another power's narrative. In late 1947, Wallace made his final move. He announced a presidential run under the Progressive Party banner. The goal was not victory, but leverage. Wallace believed that if he siphoned enough votes, Harry Truman would be forced to abandon containment. For a brief moment, the strategy appeared viable. Wallace polled in the double digits, and Democratic leaders panicked.